Hey, 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 how's everybody doing today? Welcome to the first day of class. Uh-oh. And as usual, I do not have my microphone cut off on my laptop that I've got here sitting so I can follow the chat. Hope everybody's doing well. That's fine, Josiah. Leave whenever you want. This link will become a recording as soon as this live class is over, so you can come back anytime, Josiah, and watch it at your leisure. No problem. I'm just glad you decided to stop in and say hello hello today. Looks like we've got 17 students here, which is a pretty good crowd. 20 students. Look at that. We're spinning up. Who knows? We may even get 30 or 35 people in here today. Not bad. I hope you had a good weekend. I'm sitting here in my office on South Campus, and I am freezing. They've got this, the campus temperature way down, I guess because we don't have students here, so I've got the space heater right between my legs underneath the seat trying to keep me from freezing. Looks like we've got a couple of people trying to log in right now. Lena Yen is asking for the link. If you ever have trouble getting in and you need the link, just go ahead and send me a text on Remind, and I'd be more than happy to help you out. Austin Barker, it's good to see you. Sarah Lanier, good to see you as well. It's great to see everybody who's here today. So we've got 23 people in here. Fantastic. You should have done the course entry quiz by now. We've got almost about 85% of the people have done that. If you're in the 15% that haven't done your course entry quiz, you need to go ahead and get that done, okay? Luke T, good to see you as well. Karita Watson, good to see you. Jake Denise. Karita, was it you I saw in the gym yesterday, or was that another Karita? Because I had two Karitas in my class. There's a Karita Barber and a Karita Watson. I saw one Karita in the gym. That was you. All right, she was getting her exercise on yesterday. I was so proud of her. Thank you, Whitaker. Definitely need the space heater here in my Wake Tech office. I've got this huge glass window. It's probably 12 feet long by about 6 feet high. When I first got this office, I was like, wow, this is the greatest office. I've got so much glass I can look out onto South Campus. But I don't think this glass is insulated because I freeze in the winter and I burn up in the summer. Good morning, Yasmin. Good morning, Morgan J. Are any of you, is the video freezing up for many of you? I'm looking here at my YouTube studio feed, and it does not appear to be freezing up for me. That may be just you, Morgan J. I'm sorry, check your internet provider. They're not doing you a good job, right? Holy cow, it's good for everybody. Okay, fantastic. Sorry, Morgan, that must mean it's user error. Sometimes that happens to me, so I've got I'm watching my statistics here on both of my monitors, and hopefully, and it looks like it's good on my side, so it might just be you. Okay, let's go ahead. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions? Is there anything I can answer for you? You had any trouble with the class so far? Are there any things I can do for you before we get started? I'm going to give you a second. Saleh, yeah, I think that might be you and Morgan. Salah, is it Salah or Salih? If it's Salah, type 1. If it's Salih, type 2. So I'll know how to refer to you, my friend. Salah 1, Salih 2. Okay, let's see. We've got 34 students here. Salah. Very good. Thank you. Sorry about that. Number 1. How many assignments due this week? We have one homework assignment due on Friday, and you have the discussion board that is due on Thursday. Okay, so we have to do the discussion board on Thursday, and the homework is due on Friday. For the discussion board, you have to create one thread and respond to 2 other people's threads. And remember, I will be looking through your discussion board posts, so make sure that you are discussing important, interesting things. No giving me halfway work on your discussion boards, okay? I may not see every discussion post you post every week, but I do go through there and spend time looking at them, so don't let me catch you doing a poor job on the discussion boards. And the homework is a 20-item quiz. Okay? It's good to see you, Sandy. All right, I guess I've spent enough time goofing off, so let's go ahead and get started with the PowerPoint presentation. Chapter 1, Introducing the World of Psychology. Okay, so today's lesson, I'm going to sort of explain to you what is meant by the term scientific psychology. Then we're going to talk about the founders of psychology, and then we're going to talk about 3 classic schools of thought in psychology, and then I'm going to talk about the modern subfields of psychology. So that's what I have on tap for today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Now, here's the neat thing. Psychology, you can actually think of psychology as one of the most ancient endeavors of humankind. As long as we've had campfires and the stars to look at, people have sat around and wondered what it means to be human. So in that sense, you can think of psychology, the study of how people think and feel, as being one of the oldest endeavors we have. It's an interest in understanding how we think, feel, and behave. And in fact, in your textbook and in most psychology classes, they spend time talking about the early Greek philosophers, because you can think of these Greek philosophers as the first proto-psychologists, because they thought about how we think, feel, and behave. And in fact, if you look at the quote I have over here on the left side of the screen from Plato, human behavior flows from 3 main sources: desire, emotion, and knowledge. So Plato, in a sense, was trying to talk about what it meant to be human. So in that way, you can think of psychology as one of the oldest schools of thought in the world. However, modern psychology is scientific. Okay, it's scientific. So, and if you look over here, I have the definition for modern psychology. You'll notice it doesn't just say the study of how humans think, feel, and behave. It says it's the scientific study of how humans think, feel, and behave. And it also has an emphasis on explaining how these functions are related to or controlled by the brain. But I really want you to focus on this idea of scientific. All right. Now, science means measurement. In order for something to be scientific, you have to observe and measure things. All right. Right? So that's the difference between non-science and science. Now, don't think of science as an area of thought. So science isn't chemistry. Science isn't biology. Science isn't physics. Science is all of those, actually. Instead, science is a set of tools that allow us to study any one of these areas. So you can be a non-scientific biology, have a non-scientific interest in biology, or you can have a scientific interest in biology. You can have a non-scientific interest in chemistry, or you can have a scientific interest in chemistry. And science means you're interested in measurement. Now, here's the problem. Measuring mental states is really super duper hard. Really, how much does your self-esteem weigh, right? Typically, when we think of science, we think of weighing things, measuring things with a ruler or a measuring tape or stuff like that. But the weird thing about the mind is it's inside here. And so it's really hard to measure what goes on inside the brain. Now, we're here in the 21st century. You folks grew up in a world of IQ tests, personality tests, self-esteem scales. So you probably don't think that measuring the mind is so difficult. But you know what? I'm going to take you back about 170 years to 1850, and I'm going to suggest to you that in 1850, nobody had really realized how you could measure the mind. So the birth of modern psychology is actually going to start in the year 1851 with the first person to discover that the mind could actually be measured scientifically. Does everybody understand where we're going so far? Does that make sense? Go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know if I've made any sense so far. I'm sitting here talking to a Logitech camera, so it's hard to see if the Logitech camera is giving me a confused look or a good look. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Whitaker and Haley. Perfect, perfect, perfect. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about the three founders of psychology. Now, your book is really going to focus on a fellow named Wilhelm Wundt because he opened the first official scientific laboratory. But you know what? I don't think he is the only person who is a founder of psychology. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you that there were three people, men. Unfortunately, it was kind of sexist back in the 19th century. Actually, people would say it's kind of sexist now. Science can be. But we're going to say that in the 19th century, there were three men who were important in sort of creating what we call the modern field of psychology. Well, hello, Doug Dwong. It is good to see you. By the way, you haven't signed up for Remind. I just noticed that. Hate to call you out on YouTube, buddy, but you have not signed up for Remind, so if you could, I sure would appreciate it. Anybody in the chat bar want to type in for Doug how he can sign up for Remind? That would be really cool. Okay, so these three modern founders, we're going to go in temporal order. Gustav Fechner, who in my opinion was the most important of these three fathers because he was the first one to demonstrate a very important point about the mind. Number one, the mind behaved in a systematic manner. All right. If you've ever had your thoughts running all over the place in the middle of the night, and you think about this and you think about that, sometimes it can feel like your mind is pretty disorganized. And in 1850, people didn't think that anybody's mind acted or worked like other people's mind. It was thought that we each had sort of different mental processes going in our brain. So it was very important for people to demonstrate that the mind behaved in a systematic manner. And so this guy, Gustav Fechner, wrote a book called The Elements of Psychophysics. And it was a book about his research on sensory perception. He did vision research, he did touch research, he did sound research, so he was interested in how our senses perceive things. And he identified this very nifty thing he called the just noticeable difference, the JND. And it's the smallest that can be detected half of the time. So if you've ever been in a room with a dimmer switch and somebody decides to turn the dimmer switch and turn the lights up a little bit, how much do they have to change the dimmer switch before you can tell that the lights got brighter or the lights got darker? If you're trying to weigh two weights in your hand, how much does the weight in your left hand have to be compared to the right hand before you can tell a difference? Can you tell a difference between 21 ounces and 20 ounces? Can you tell a difference between 20 pounds and 21 pounds, right? Does that make sense? And one of the things he found was that there's a very systematic relationship between how much a stimulus changes and your ability to determine that change. And bizarrely enough, he found that it stayed the same across all sensory modalities. And he found that things had to change 1/40th of their original change. So if something changed 1/40th of its original intensity, you could detect the change half of the time. So you could tell the difference between 40 and 41 pounds. Yes, but not 80 and 81 pounds. No, okay? And so he termed this systematic change, he called this the just noticeable difference. And he demonstrated to everybody's satisfaction that the mind obeyed systematic principles. Again, I know you folks think that's a stupid thing because we live in a world of psychological tests, but you have to transport yourself back to 1850 and understand that this was a pretty novel finding, okay? Now, modern psychologists who study the senses are actually called experimental psychologists. We're going to talk about the subfields of psychology. You can actually go into psychology and be an experimental psychologist. This doesn't mean that you're the only one who does experiments. All kinds of psychologists do experiments. But psychophysics, people who did sensory experiments, were the first persons to do experiments, and that's why they were called experimental psychologists. So you can think of is Gustav Fechner as the first scientific psychologist, although you know what? He was not called a psychologist because you couldn't get that label. It hadn't been invented yet. It would still be another 30 years before you could be a psychologist. He instead called himself a psychophysiologist, and he called what he was doing psychophysiology because it hadn't been invented yet. Psychology hadn't been invented yet. Now, the second guy, actually I should have gone to this slide first, in 1879 was this fellow named Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist in Leipzig, Germany, and he opened the first psychology lab. Before he opened his lab, you could not get a PhD in psychology. But he opened his lab in 1879 and started handing out the first PhDs. Now, he championed a brand of psychology called structuralism that Chapter 1 is going to talk about. And it's the study of how mental experience is organized in the mind. What are the pieces of our sensory experiences? Now, he was still interested in the senses, but he was interested in how they were structured, not how it worked. You know what? His approach is actually so poor that it quickly fell out of favor. And really, we don't talk about Wilhelm Wundt's approach to psychology anymore. However, many of his students would become important psychologists in the United States, which was experiencing a boom in the higher education institution, and they needed professors and scientists. So people would go to his lab. They would get their piece of paper, which is what all of you are here for. You're all here for a piece of paper. They would get their piece of paper, and then they would sail across the Atlantic Ocean. And you'll notice underneath me, I have a map right now that shows you all of the new universities that were being established in the late 19th century in the United States. In each and every one of these schools was creating this new department called the psychology department, and they needed psychology professors. So all of his students would come across and began to create what would become the big psychology movement here in the United States. And actually, really in the first probably 50 years of psychology, you can think of the United States, Germany, and Russia as being kind of the three big areas in which scientific psychology was exploding in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Any questions so far? I hope that this makes sense. Now, so we've got somebody demonstrates you can scientifically measure the mind. We've got somebody who's created a laboratory where you can actually become a psychologist and get that label. And then we have a fellow named William James who wrote the first psychology textbook. Again, it was early in the history of psychology, so he was not even a psychologist. He was actually a Harvard philosopher. But he wrote this book, and I think it was published in 1890, called The Principles of Psychology. It was a huge two-volume text, you'll see, that's right underneath me, called The Principles of Psychology. Huge, heavy books. And it was it's become, if you will, the roadmap for psychology in the 20th century, because a lot of the topics that he sort of laid out as being areas of interest that we should begin to study, actually, what's that word, sort of caused people to go out and start studying those things. So he sort of laid out the different areas of psychology that we should probably be studying. And so you can think of William James as being sort of the blueprint for how psychology would begin developing in the next 50 years. Okay? Now, unlike Wundt, who was a structuralist and thought we should study the structure of the mind, William James championed the study of functionalism, which is the study of how mental processes impact our behavior, what functions mental processes studied. He wasn't so interested in trying to explain what mental processes looked like. He was more interested in studying the functions that they serve. And in fact, he coined the term stream of consciousness. Anybody ever heard the term stream of consciousness before? I'm going to see if somebody types that in, yes or no. But he suggested that measuring the structure of the mind was kind of like trying to measure the structure of a river. Think about taking yourself a cup of water and dipping it into a river, going down to a river and dipping out a cup of water, right? And he thought that measuring the mind multiple times was kind of like dipping the cup of water into the stream multiple times. And if you dip a cup into a stream and pull out some water, and then pour that water back in the stream, and then dip your cup in again, will you get the same water the second time? No, you will not. And he argued that measuring the structure of the mind was kind of like measuring a stream multiple times. He said consciousness is a stream, and so it's really hard to measure, right? So these are the three founders of psychology. Gustav Fechner, who was the first to demonstrate that the mind could be measured. Wilhelm Wundt, who opened up the first psychology lab and handed out the first PhDs. And William James, who wrote the first textbook that was kind of a roadmap for psychology in the 20th century. And remember, psychology is a relatively new science in that scientific psychology relies on systematic measurements and observation. And everything I talk about this semester is going to be based on experiments and observations that were conducted, okay? So we're not going to talk about how we feel or how we think or how somebody in an English textbook wrote about what the mind is. We're only going to talk about those things that can be observed and demonstrated, okay? Psychology is a science, and in fact, there are still things about the human being that are beyond measurement. It's really difficult at this point to measure consciousness, just like William James suggested. It's really difficult to measure consciousness, and I would argue that at this point, the study of consciousness is almost still a little bit beyond the field of scientific psychology. Okay? So, let's go ahead and talk about schools of thought. You know what? There are different ways of thinking about the human being. And in the first 50 years of psychology, different psychologists came up with different ways of focusing at the human being, focusing on the human being. All right? So, if I was going to study the human being, you can study how their brain and biology works, right? But then you can also study how their early childhood experiences affect them, right? Or you could study how people think, and that could be another way to study human beings. So if I ask you the question, why did Fred do that? You're going to tell me, well, gee, there are lots of reasons why a person named Fred could do the things they do. And so in the early history of psychology, different important psychologists said, you know what, let's study the human being this way. And so your book in chapter 1 is going to have a table called Psychology's Schools of Thought. And these were just different ways of approaching the study of a human being. All right? And there are tons of different angles, if you will, for studying a human being, right? And they are listed here below you. So from 1850 to 1950, early psychologists debated the best way to think about the human being. Now, it turns out that each of these schools of thoughts has value. No one of these schools of thoughts is better than the other. Now, these psychologists that you see written on this table thought that their way was better than the other, but really, these are just different levels of analysis for studying the human being. And so these schools of thought were each led by an important figure in psychology. Each of these had ways in which they were better than the other approaches at studying human beings, and each of these ways had weaknesses compared to the other approaches to studying human beings. And all of these approaches, for the most part, are still represented in psychological theory, even though we don't talk about them that much. However, your book's going to focus on 3 of these important schools of thought, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about them if you don't mind, okay? So there is psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and cognitive psychology. All right, so let's see. The first is the psychoanalytic school of thought. Now, it was championed by this fellow named Sigmund Freud underneath me. Have any of you ever heard of Sigmund Freud? Anybody ever heard of Sigmund Freud? I'll wait for just a second and see if you can type in the chat bar and let me know if you've heard of Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud was probably the first rock star psychologist. He became super famous. Lots of people loved him, and you know what? Even more people hated him and thought he was a fraud. But he was certainly the most famous of the first psychologists in terms of the popular culture. He was the first one that everybody knew about. And in fact, a lot of you have not, those of you who have not taken a psychology class still have probably heard of his name. And what he thought was he realized that there are a lot of conflicts that occur in our life that cause us to feel bad about ourselves, that really affect how we live our life. And so he said the most important thing to understanding people's behavior is uncovering the unconscious motivations and conflicts that drive your behavior. Have any of you ever had something really bad and embarrassing that happened to you as a kid? Has anybody ever heard of somebody that was maybe abused as a child or sexually abused as a child, and they've forgotten about the abuse, but it still affects their life? Okay, Sigmund Freud was the first person to focus on the impact that these early childhood events and the bad feelings that they caused how they affected us. So Sigmund Freud was interested in the power of psychological conflict and how it affects our lives. And he argued that people are driven by unconscious drives. Now, lots of different psychodynamic psychologists say there are lots of different drives, but Freud thought that we were all driven by the motivation for sex. All right? He coined the term libido. I don't know if you've ever heard the term libido, but he used that term to describe this well of sexual drive that we all have that influences our behavior. And he argued that because society has really strict rules on how we can demonstrate our sexual impulses and sexual drives, that people a lot of times are forced to hide their real sexual motivations. I'm sure some of you may have had sexual motivations that you're embarrassed about, that you don't feel comfortable sharing with other people. I'm sure a lot of you are probably even embarrassed to talk about sexual feelings in front of a group of people. That's exactly what he was talking about. He argued that we have this drive that's in our body that's so important, but there are so many rules and we feel so embarrassed about it that we hide this energy. And he argued that this psychological conflict affected our personality. And he even came up with the term defense mechanism, which is a way in which we manage our anxiety. Have any of you ever told somebody that you're being defensive? Has anybody ever accused you of being defensive before? If they're accusing you of being defensive, they're describing one of Freud's defense mechanisms. Some people repress feelings. That is, they feel bad about something, so they just try to forget about it so that it doesn't bother them. That's a defense mechanism. Some people do what's called become reactive. Oh my God. And so you may feel a certain way about a sexual way, but you hide it and you actually turn it into the opposite impulse in order to hide the embarrassment that you feel for having this motivation. And Sigmund Freud thought that people were driven by unconscious sexual drives. Now, you'll notice that I've got neo-Freudians written underneath him. A lot of people thought Freud was onto something when he talked about conflicts in our personality, but they thought that maybe it wasn't always related to sex. So these neo-Freudians thought that there were other drives that were important. For example, security or dominance. Anybody ever heard of the term inferiority complex? This is when a person feels bad and inferior about themselves, but they don't want to admit it, so it causes them to act in certain ways. If you've ever heard of the term inferiority complex, you're talking about a psychoanalytic motivation. So that's one of the most important, one of the earliest schools of thought. Now, the second area of if you will, school of thought was championed by a fellow named John Watson, who thought that really, let's not worry about things we can't see, like sexual motivations or being defensive or having an inferiority complex. Instead, let's focus on the environment and how it shapes our behavior. He said, you know what, you really can't measure the mind because you can't see it. Now, you can give somebody a questionnaire, but really you didn't actually see their mind. So he wanted to focus on things that you could actually see, your behavior. If you want to know whether or not I like Fred, well then watch how I behave towards Fred. And don't just listen to how I say what I talk about liking Fred, but actually watch how I behave towards Fred. If any of you have ever trained a dog to shake hands, to sit, to roll over, how to poop outside and not poop inside, you have used behaviorist techniques. John Watson and his colleagues were focused on understanding how environmental forces like reinforcements or rewards and punishments would change our behavior. If you've ever had a parent spank you in order to keep you from doing something bad, you've been exposed to behaviorist training. And so these folks focused on reinforcement and punishment, which was learning by consequences, and also how we associated things in our environment. And they did a lot of their research using animals such as pigeons, dogs, rats, and even cats. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 6. And this guy, John Watson, even took this little toddler named Albert and trained him to have a phobia. He trained little Albert to be afraid of white, fuzzy things. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 6. Okay? Now, not his student, but a person that followed after him was named B.F. Skinner. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of B.F. Skinner, but you can rightly call him the second rock star psychologist as well. And by rock star, I mean somebody who's important outside of the field. There were lots of psychologists who were important inside the field, but B.F. Skinner was sort of the second one that everybody knew the name of, even if they weren't a psychologist themselves. Okay? And so he created this thing called a Skinner box, which I'm going to show to you. I've actually got one sitting up here above me right now. I'm going to show you that in chapter 6. And he actually thought that we could create utopia using reinforcement and punishing. So he argued that we're all just like dogs and pigeons, and we can be trained by reinforcements and punishments. And he argued we could get rid of crime, we could get rid of obesity, we could get rid of drug use if we used behaviorist principles. So that was a very controversial sort of point of view. And we're going to talk about him a little bit later. Okay? And then the third school of thought that I want you to be familiar with is the cognitive school of thought. Now, the first computer, you folks probably, most of you never even grew up in a world without the internet, much less a world without a computer. But you know what? In the 1940s, the computer hadn't been invented yet. And so people didn't really think about information processing systems. But the first computer was invented in the late 40s by a fellow named, well, lots of people were involved in it, but a fellow named John von Neumann's, who I'm going to focus on. And he created this huge computer. It was as big as a room. It wasn't the small little computer like the one you have in your phone now. It was as big as a room. And it was an information processing system. You could put information in, kind of like when you hear stuff. And he had a program that he had in it that would manipulate that information, and then something would come out the other side called output, which is what you do when you talk. And as soon as the computer was invented, people said, hey, wait a minute, maybe human brains work kind of like computers. And so the cognitive revolution was born, and a bunch of psychologists said, you know what, the best way to study the mind is to see how it is similar to or different from a computer. And so we're going to talk about that in chapter 7. And there's actually this fellow named George Miller. They talk about him in right underneath me. They talk about him in chapter 7. He came up with this really cool observation. He called it Miller's magic number. And it's the number of things you can juggle in your short-term memory at one time. So if I ask you, Caitlin, hey, I need you to stop by the grocery store and pick me up some stuff from the local Lowe's, Caitlin, and I start listing things out, you're going to have trouble remembering more than about 9 of those things. You're going to remember somewhere between 5 and 9 of those things before you start forgetting them. So, Caitlin, I need you to pick up bananas, yogurt, spaghetti. I need you to pick up some butter, some coffee, some hot chocolate, some milk. You need to get some frozen pizzas, some beer. We need some apples. Are you starting to get confused a little bit, Caitlin? Maybe you're saying, holy cow, I can't remember that many things. Miller's magic number. It's the number of things most people can juggle in their mind at one time. Inspired by the invention of the first computers, and the cognitive psychologists study how we remember things, how we pay attention, how we solve problems, and how language is learned. Okay? So that's what we're going to focus on. Oh. Now it looks like, okay, it looks like my computer slowed down for a minute. I apologize. Am I still choppy, or did I come back to you now? Did I come back to you? I do apologize. Now, one last thing I want to talk about before I let you go. One last thing I want to talk about. Now, after World War II, psychology became super duper professional. And they decided that just like the medical fields, it would be better if we organized psychology in terms of areas of specialization. So, do you folks know what a cardiologist studies? What does a cardiologist study? A cardiologist is a doctor that studies the heart. Does anybody know what an OB/GYN studies? They're a doctor who specializes in something else, right? Have any of you ever been to a podiatrist before? What does a podiatrist study? They study your feet, right? They help people with their feet. All of these people are doctors, but they have specializations in different areas of psychology. So just like medical doctors have professional specialties, psychologists have professional specialties as well. So there are different subfields of psychology. For example, I am a social psychologist. Do you see social psychologist on this list right here? A social psychologist, I study how people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings are affected by the groups that they find themselves in. You ever heard the term peer pressure before? Or being socially influenced before? If you've ever had someone try to persuade you of something, you have been affected by social psychological forces. So I am an expert in peer pressure and group functioning. That's what I do. And in fact, when I went to college to get my PhD, you can even see it on my diploma. My diploma says Chris Roddenberry has a PhD in social psychologist. Now, what does this mean? This means that if you have a psychological problem and you need help with your anxiety or your depression or your bipolar disorder, I am not the kind of person who can help you. That's not my area of psychology. That's not my subfield. Does that make sense? Every time I meet one of my, when I go to a cocktail party with my wife and I meet one of her business friends, they always say, "Oh my God, you're a psychologist? I'll bet you can help me because my family's crazy." And I always think to myself, nope, that's not me. I'm not that kind of psychologist. That would be the same thing as asking a heart doctor to help you with your feet. It just doesn't make sense. So, for the exam, I want you to be familiar with the areas of the subfields of psychology. And these represent the different official degrees that you can get. When you go get a PhD, you don't get a PhD in psychology, you get a PhD in biological psychology. You don't get a PhD in psychology, you get a PhD in developmental psychology, or in health psychology, or in social psychology. Does that make sense, folks? And so these are the subfields of psychology. Now, this seems like a lot of information. You're like, how am I going to be able to tell these psychologists apart? You know what? At the end of this semester, this will be the easiest thing you do. And in fact, this chart right here that's beside me, table 1.2, I can promise you that this will be on your final exam. I'm going to want you to know the difference between a biological psychologist and a cognitive psychologist. So a biological psychologist studies how the brain and the chemicals in the brain affect our functioning. That's going to be chapter 2. A cognitive psychologist studies how we process information in our mind. They study memory, attention, and problem solving. That's going to be chapter 7. Developmental psychologists, they study how we change as we grow up. Have you ever heard of maturity, when things mature? Developmental psychologists study how we mature as we grow up. 2-year-olds are different from 4-year-olds, who are different from 40-year-olds. That's going to be chapter 4. Health psychologists are those folks who help us understand how to combat stress and how to live healthier lives. And so they examine the psychological factors that affect health and well-being. That's going to be chapter 10. Okay? Personality psychologists are the ones that make up personality tests that help measure our personality. That's going to be chapter 12. Chapter 12, yes. Social psychologist is the study of how we function in groups and how groups of people affect our behavior. That's going to be chapter 13. Clinical psychologists are the people that treat you when you're suffering from a psychological disorder. If any of you are suffering from anxiety or depression or bipolar and you have been to see a psychologist, you saw a clinical psychologist. That's chapter 14. All right? Educational psychologists are those people who try to scientifically understand how people learn. They're not the people that treat you when you have a problem at school. They're the people who create theories that try to understand how people learn. And in fact, educational psychology isn't even really covered in this textbook, so there's not really a chapter that we're going to do on that. And then industrial psychology is the brand of psychology that helps you use psychology to better, that helps bosses learn how to have happier employees and make more money. That's also not going to be covered in this book. But you'll notice I've got a link here to the APA. There are 56 different types of psychologists that you can actually be. If you're interested, I invite you to click on that link in the course resources folder of Blackboard and look around at all the different ways in which you can be a psychologist. Okay, last thing I'm going to mention before I let you go. We're at 11:43. Where do you find psychologists? Everywhere, man, everywhere. But you know what? Half of all psychologists are either going to be found in hospitals or universities, right? Now, and then we're going to find some that work in government centers, some that work for businesses, some work for schools, some you'll see in medical schools, and then some of them open their own practices. And those of you who have been to see a clinical psychologist probably saw them at an independent practice. And you'll find them everywhere, but the majority of them are going to be found in either universities or hospitals. Now, right underneath me, I do want you to sort of understand that psychologists kind of have two different activities. Psychologists either engage in basic research, which is those are the scientists that are discovering new things, all right? And then there are psychologists who apply what the basic researchers find to help people out. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So if you're a basic researcher like George Miller, the guy who figured out the magic number, we can keep 7 things in our memory at one time, in our short-term memory at one time, he was a basic researcher trying to understand how the mind works. You're going to find most of your basic researchers, almost all of your basic researchers, are going to be at universities or 4-year colleges, which is where most of the science is done. All of your applied psychologists are going to be found in hospitals, government centers, businesses, schools, or independent practices. And those are the people who use what the basic researchers have found to help treat people. So as I suggested to you, John Watson demonstrated, he was a basic researcher who demonstrated how we learn phobias, right? He was a basic researcher. Now, a clinical psychologist is an applied psychologist who used what John Watson learned to help treat people who are suffering from phobic disorders. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? All right, so today's lecture, what I really wanted you to understand was the fact that psychology is scientific. It's an interest in the mind, but it's not just an interest in the mind, but instead it's an interest in the mind that is backed up by research and observation, measurement and observation. I did wanted you to know that there are 3 people who were important in creating what we call the modern field of psychology. All right. Now, I also wanted you to understand that there are different ways to study the human being. You can study them from these different schools of thought. You can focus on them as computers. You can focus on them as conflict-ridden people. You can focus on them as just animals that learn from the environment that punishes or reinforces them. And then finally, I wanted you to know that in modern psychology, we have different areas of specialization just like they do in the medical field. All right? For this week's homework, I'm going to ask you to demonstrate understanding of those topics that I've covered today and that I'll cover on Wednesday. Remember, you only get 1 attempt at your homework, but you can take as long as you want to do it. You can stop and start all week long. So I invite you to open up your homework and go through it slowly while watching this lecture and answer the questions as I discuss them. Do any of you have questions for me? Anybody have a question for me before I let you go? It is 11:47. I'm going to try to get done in 45 minutes, but it may be 50 minutes for each lecture. Anybody have any questions? I'm going to wait for just a second. If you do have a question and you don't have time to ask it in the chat bar, you should feel free to send me a remind text. I would be more than happy to discuss that. And if you need to, you can bounce into Microsoft Teams and we can have a discussion through video chat. Did everybody enjoy today's lecture? Did you understand what I was talking about? Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate that. Folks, y'all have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.